going to be looking today at the role that AI policies and other frameworks have within newsrooms and why it is that there has been kind of this push for these evolving frameworks, looking at the different forms and approaches that they've taken, the role this can play in building trust, mitigating against harms, what kind of strategies we can use for facilitating collaboration, and questions around issues like accountability, oversight, implementation of these policies. My name's Avani Singh. I'm an attorney based in Johannesburg, with my work focusing specifically on media law and digital rights. And I am delighted to introduce the panelists to you today. With me, I have Natali Helberger from the AI, Media and Democracy Lab at the University of Amsterdam, who has extensive hands-on experience in developing codes of conduct for the industry and addressing other issues such as copyright and licensing, including in assisting in the AI office in the EU in its current draft code. I have Haider from the Aapti Institute, whose work focuses on various issues regarding digital access, social transformations through technology, culture-driven perspectives on technology, and digital ecosystems of trust, including questions around security, accountability, and inclusion. And lastly, I have Scott Timcke, a senior research associate at Research ICT Africa and an affiliate with the Center for Information, Technology, and Public Life at the University of North Carolina. Scott is a political economist of AI and democratic life, whose book, Algorithms and the End of Politics, was released last year. I'll be posting links to everyone's bio in the chat, so you'll be able to have a chance to read more about the work that they've done and their publications. But please feel free, and I encourage you, please, to pop your questions in the Q&A section within the chat so that we can build on the conversation. So around the world, what we're seeing is this global trend towards different stakeholders, be it governments, industries, and so on, trying to find ways of dealing with artificial intelligence, and in many ways, looking at considerations around regulation, which brings with it a range of complexities of the unknown, of regulatory lags, whether these are fit for purpose, where to target these frameworks, which actors, what types of behaviors, what kinds of risks. Should this take the form of binding legislation or guiding principles? And how do we deal with asymmetries in power between organizations or stakeholders based in global South countries that don't have the same access or are unable to exert the same levels of control over the large platforms and AI companies? We also commonly hear the argument that regulation is antithetical to innovation and that we should be cautious about regulation. But at the same time, there's a big question around, without such frameworks, how do we achieve oversight, accountability, mitigate harm, redress, which is made all the more complex in the situation that's faced by the media in the context of journalism, where trust and credibility is so critical, where self-regulation remains a hallmark of the industry through ethical standards enforced by the industry itself, and a real want, as has come out in the previous panel, of wanting to understand what AI can be used for and how to harness the potential whilst mitigating against these harms. So Natali, I'm going to turn to you first, and drawing on the very interesting and informative survey that you co-authored with the Associated Press, which looked at different areas around the use of AI in newsrooms. What are some of the trends that you've seen in terms of the pressing needs around regulation or a want for frameworks within newsrooms? Is this something that has come out quite strongly, and what are sort of the tenets of that?
Yes, thank you so much, Avani, for this question and for inviting me to be here and discuss about these issues, which, as we found in the survey, are critical. And I'm happy to put a link to the survey into the chat in a moment. Because so one of the questions we ask about ethical concerns, but we also ask, how do you handle these concerns? And the most prominent way of handling ethical concerns around Gen AI was not using it. And that shows you how incredibly important it is to talk about the ethical and legal issues and make sure that the sector and journalists feel safe and can trust the technology. because otherwise a response is not good using it, and also foregoing the potential. There are many exciting opportunities of Gen AI for journalism. So that was something that really struck me with this survey. Something else that I found remarkable is that the second most prominent strategy of dealing with these issues is around human oversight, a huge trust that by monitoring the output of these systems, we'll be able to catch all the legal and professional and ethical issues. And I think this is something really to think about, because a lot of the sources of concerns about the use of Gen AI in journalism that we see when talking also to media organizations are concerns around bias, the lack of quality, lack of accuracy, the lack of explainability. And these are all issues that you do not catch at the output level, where you really need to have also more oversight and also say in the input level, and how these models are trained, what kind of data goes in. And as we all know, the whole discussion of what kind of data goes into these models is a huge controversy right now in the sector, also because there's a lot of copyright protected content going in there. So more discussion also on, and I really feel that there's also a bit of lack of awareness that simply monitoring the output will not solve these issues, but that there is a real need for more control and more of a say also in the input and the training of these models, and assistance when procuring responsible models. That really could help. And you already mentioned asymmetries, which is part of the problem, right? Because a lot of these models are general purpose models that are made for all kinds of uses. So finding ways of maybe also fine-tuning own models and pooling data together, and finding ways really for the sector also to cooperate, I think is an important way of addressing some of the issues. And with the Council of Europe, we also try to develop procurement guidelines to help organizations to actually make decisions. How does a responsible technology look like that we can actually use, and be more critical? Because I do think that the sector has also a lot of, ideally, I mean, there is real buying power, and by steering demand for more responsible models, I think the sector can do a lot. And regulation, because regulation is also mentioned as the enemy of innovation, and the journalism sector has been always very careful about regulation, and for good reasons. But I think it's also important to notice that regulation can have an important role in setting standards for more trustworthy AI, for more respect for copyrights, for more transparency. And that's why I think the discussions in Brussels are also so important right now, because there we experiment with a whole new set of regulations.
And I thank you, Nat, because I want to come back to some of the points that you've raised around sort of the content of what these frameworks are looking at. But maybe you can also talk to us a little bit, based on your work around codes of conduct. What are the different kinds of forms that these AI policies or frameworks are taking, from sort of the implications of binding legislation all the way to sort of guidelines and advisory approaches?
Yeah, something that I find really remarkable about the journalism sector, also compared to other sectors, is that there's a lot of activity right now in developing ethical guidance. Some of these are developed top-down by industry standards or regulation. There's a lot of bottom-up work also, where really within an organization there's an attempt to get the different relevant parts, R&D, journalism, editorial, management, together to develop together a vision on how to use this technology responsible. So there's a lot of activity here. We see that some guidelines are more influential than others. For example, the BBC machine learning guidelines are very often served as or the Bayerische Rundfunk guidelines or the Guardians are very often serve as a reference point also for maybe also other newsrooms. And it's really interesting to see how this is going. In practice, we also see an immense principle to practice gap. So all these guidelines are very beautiful, and I think we can all agree about the importance of transparency, oversight, explainability, and so far. But the really devil sits in the implementation. And I think so next to thinking about guidelines, we also really need to think about how to create room and space within organizations to experiment and really try to figure out together, what does diversity really mean for us? What does transparency mean for us? And I think there's a lot of work still to be there done. And I think it's really important to understand that ethical use of AI, that's not something that you magically create, it's a process. And you really have to create the conditions and the room within organizations for this, and also the agency of different parts in the newsroom to be an active part of that process.
And Ava, maybe turning to you next, based on the work that you've been doing around looking at issues of inclusion and accountability within the use of tech, what, for newsrooms grappling with this, building on what Natali has said around this being a process, what are some of the strategies or approaches that you've seen or that you would recommend in ensuring that this is collaborative and inclusive when newsrooms are trying to develop their own policies?
So I think just the first thing I'd like to say is that what we have to remember, I think, with each new piece of technology that comes about is that we have had this dance before, and we have had this anxiety before, and we have had this, almost panic, I think, around how are we going to integrate and think about this piece of technology with the traditional way of doing this, right? And now I think with social media, where there was suddenly the freedom to publicly debate the value of news and being able to comment on world events, that redefined what it meant to be in the media space. And with opinions gaining the same level of traction that news stories do, and that abundance that it comes with, we're also dealing with a level of replicability, which I think is a very core feature of AI, whether it's AI or generative AI. And that's something we have to come back to, right? And with social media, what we saw was that there was a democratization, I think, of the power of publishing and media and getting your voice out there. And I think it wasn't necessarily a threat to the way that traditional journalism operated, but it pushed newsrooms to get more creative about their digital formats, right? And so, similarly then with AI, what we're seeing is problems of replicability, of abundance, of unverifiability. And so these risks are present, but they're only as dangerous as they are invisible. And so good AI frameworks recognize that the sort of ambiguity of any kind contributes to that danger. So it isn't about banning the use of AI or making arguments for why it is always going to be biased. It doesn't matter who the human in the loop is. You're never going to get away from that. I think that that's not sort of the rooted take, but it's about being super transparent and definitive, as some of the previous speakers have also said. And I think that we also have to keep asserting power over AI. That's the other one, which is to say that, we have to be able to say that, yes, as a piece of tech, you are very smart, you are very efficient, you help me do my job in this way, but I, the human being, know more than you and know you better than you know yourself. And that isn't just something that journalists have to do, I think, and people in that media space, research space, basically anyone in that content distribution space. It's not just someone as a producer of content and news that you have to do, but you have to be able to give this power to consumers of news and consumers of content in that same way, right? And so that self-consciousness is something you see now being explored through conversations on algorithmic authenticity as well. And so some of the work I've been doing over the last 2 years looks at understanding trust and understanding how do we even look at trust in the context of data personalization and how services are also tailored to people and whether that's okay to do to a certain extent, right? And who's to say that people won't just do that with news as well? Is understand what is it that this person is going to receive well, what is it that they're going to want to read, and therefore we cater in that same way. I think there's a very fine line, between types of media and types of consumption in any case. And so we have to remember that media is, that fine line exists essentially. And people don't necessarily distinguish what they consider a piece of news versus what they consider a piece of content online. And so it's about also training the user in terms of what they see as, something that has come from well-researched, experienced journalists in the space, and something that has come from, an argument online. And so I think, not to sort of get flippant about that distinction, but we do have to think about that readability that people have with online formats, right? And so I think that, and this is something that this professor at Utrecht University called Pinar Yolam, and I'll link their work below in a bit, has talked about how we as human beings sometimes want to hear, I don't know, from a digital system, because that's also how we make decisions to trust in other human beings. We don't want perfection because that's kind of suspicious, but we do want authenticity, right? And I think that when we think about sort of that, I think the point on inclusion is well made, and I'll say one thing on that, which is that we do have to think about Global South and marginalized communities at the core of defining the risks that AI pose, particularly to their representation online. There's many facets to it, right? It's not just what you consume in terms of what minorities will consume, what they're able to consume, what is the infrastructure available, but also what is their representation and what is it that their voice translates to in terms of news about them. And so this is also particular in the case of language differences, right? And the accessibility that comes from that. And yeah, I think that part of how that is done is through heavily invested user literacy around AI, both being able to comprehend its impact and identify its presence. And this is done by a high level of transparency in your own workings, in a certain sense. But just to kind of come back to this point on authenticity, right? Because I think that that benefits everyone equally, which is to say that it's not about being able to do the job with AI to silently improve the way your news is being produced, but that you and your audience are constantly aware of how AI is used and how to separate that from how you and they construct responses and opinions. And so I think that heavy human verification is something that has been talked about before. Also, explicit mentions of unfair use as well as fair use come down to that slightly more implementational point, as Natali was saying earlier. And these are really important practices as well, so that we know even within that, who are we leaving out, who are we accounting for? And so I think that really good AI frameworks and policies that are inclusive, that are collaborative, they look at accountability not just from the perspective of, are you making sure that the way you've trained and used the AI is authentic, transparent, et cetera, but then what is also the competitive element in terms of you and other media entities that are using AI, right? And so looking at self-regulation frameworks are also important in the context of how different news entities use AI. And that's something we should consider as well, as different industries look at self-regulation. In Australia and New Zealand, you do have self-regulation entities of social media organizations. And so what is the transparency that affords? I think that that's something else that creates a more public responsibility as well as a responsibility between media organizations to be able to do justice in that sense. And so, I'm going to link some of this professor's work in terms of algorithmic trustworthiness, but I also would direct people just to the Pointer Institute's work on this, where they do look at a template for what a basic generative AI policy in a newsroom should look like. And it does capture a lot of hard rules and implementational points, not just principles and values. But I think that's what I would say in general about how we can think about not just making sort of what works for AI is transparency, but how that transparency is, interpreted at the level of authenticity is really important.
Thanks. Thank you, Eva. And I'm going to come back to you on some of those points that you raised. But Scott, I want to ask you to jump in here, in particular around the work that you have been doing or looking into around issues of trust and the different, that link between whether or not, I suppose, regulation or policy frameworks can foster trust in the media, and how we try and locate that trust, where we draw those links.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful question. Matters of trust are something we can speak about for hours and on hours. But so the first thing to me is I think that we also need to recognize the social context and setting in which trustworthy environments are created. And there's a limited extent to which journalists and journalists' practice can do that. Over the last couple of years, we've very much heard, our lexicon has changed. Words like the polycrisis have emerged now, the sort of tip of our tongue. And these larger dynamics certainly shape the extent to which trust can be, exercised by the media, and to which extent people have trustworthy relationships to that. So, the first thing I think we need to recognize that there is a larger spillover effect from the wider world, from other, whether you call it the rise of reactionary powers or whether you call it democratic backsliding, or in the African context, leaders for life are reasserting themselves, that these things very much are shaping expectations for news practice, journalism, and the like. There's certainly a space for regulation over here. There's certainly codes of conduct and self-regulatory sector-specific stuff is very important, and we should never say no to that. We've spoken a little bit, or the previous panel spoke quite a lot about transparency mechanisms and labeling. Those things are obviously things that should be embraced. But I think there are other ways that we can also toy with the idea around trust, particularly for low-resourced environments that might not be able to have the types of tools at their disposal. And I'm thinking over here of mechanisms like data trusts or community data sharing agreements amongst low-resourced newsrooms that they may be able to actually have a great impact with the resources that they have at their disposal. So creating regulatory environments so that you can have news co-ops, data sharing trusts, I think that's valuable and could have very positive developments, particularly if we're thinking about the experimentation with newsrooms in the 21st century. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. And also, I think linked to that is this sort of disjunct or this kind of tension we're seeing between AI tools sort of driving this information disorder and on the one hand versus the value that it can play in newsrooms in kind of combating that and providing credible, informative information to the public in the public interest. For you, and from what you've seen, and what would some of the sort of hallmarks be of a policy framework or a regulatory framework in the public interest that would support newsrooms and kind of playing that pivotal role in combating the information disorder?
So one of the things I think that very useful for experimenting on when it comes to tracking information disorders and these types of matters is community trust, data trust that allow cross-referencing of sources. We know that fact-checking is useful. Sometimes people overestimate how useful fact-checking can be. It's not a magic key to solve all of the world's problems, but things like this, if you have data sharing agreements or if you have data trusts, that people can then start to cross-reference and build out thicker news resources that people can, so news consumers themselves may be able to start, being a little bit more engaged and interactive with the news that they're consuming. So I think that's certainly an element that needs to be worked upon. The next element is, to what extent do we need new regulations, or that we haven't yet fully hit the ceiling of our current regulatory environments? So, that varies by country and sort of treaty space. But in South Africa, at least, there's this whole new emphasis on trying to create an AI Act. There's a massive push towards this, but it's occurring in an environment where people haven't yet exhausted current frameworks and regulatory parameters. So sometimes, there is this push to create the novel, the idea that this new type of technology must sweep away everything that's come before, all that is solid melts into air kind of stuff. And I think we do need to just be also attentive to where can we use our existing regulatory apparatus and then start to look for the novel, the gaps that are emerging now. So those are my 2 cents on that matter.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And Arvid, just and coming back to some of the points you raised based on the input that we've heard, we also have a question from the chat around. The question says, often media houses update and correct errors on their websites over time. In such cases, who bears the legal responsibility for any incorrect content that AI-generated tools might have used during that period? Natali, I'm going to ask this to you as well, based on your findings from the survey, from the report that you did. But Ava, maybe you can speak a little bit to sort of, based on the work that you've done, how do we try and locate issues around accountability, responsibility, oversight for the use of AI in newsrooms?
So I think, and I think the other question also that's been noted during the panel kind of speaks to some of why we have to think about regulation as well very closely. But I think just the first point on this, right? I don't know if there's ever always one answer in terms of who is accountable for the use of that tool, because you have the builder of the tool, you have the person using it, you have not just the person using it, but very specifically the organization, the newsroom that is responsible in that sense. And so I think that's what makes it so interesting, is that it implicates so many different types of stakeholders, but it also implicates all kinds of different data that goes into it, right? So, but broadly, just to say, I think that with self-regulation, 100% agree that when we talk about its ability to shield almost also just the workings of how different entities do what they do and how they actually submit to transparency and protocols, I think that we have to consider that counterweight. And I also think that we have to consider how much more important it is for media entities or any kind of corporation to believe that by regulating themselves or by submitting to a structure like that, they might be able to avoid some level of, government regulation or avoid some level of where are their hands more tied kind of, right? And I think that where regulation is critical is because of that competitive element of, hey, I have to behave because if I don't behave, somebody else will also not behave. And so just on that, right, I think that we have to think about those ways in which we can operationalize transparency. And so looking at something like a self-regulatory structure helps, at least in some of the work we've also done, helps us think about making accountability a defining practice or a pattern for AI policies. And so you can't think about AI without thinking about accountability, right? Because the function of that works in that way. I think also it helps entities create terms of cooperation that help define willing and more voluntary boundary creation based on what could be public redressal processes. And I think that, and I sort of have more to say, I think, on just whether or not AI is also the answer for journalism, given what a human-led activity it is. And I think it's okay to also consider that it is a very well-governed toy or it's a very shiny weapon. And I think that the cooperation that is undertaken between different entities in that space, right? Whether it's the media entity or the regulator or entities with each other, it's okay to have those discussions and arrive at the conclusion that AI isn't always the best tool when it comes to accountable content creation, and therefore should we use it for content creation at all? Doesn't remove the fact that it can be used for other things, but I think that's why we have to constantly revisit that question, right? Is that if we're constantly coming up against inaccuracy, which can lead to some kind of political cost, human cost, maybe we need to consider that you can't really regulate for that. And so what are the ethical uses of AI that don't require regulation or accountability on things that have for so many years, for so many decades, been led by human error? And so that has been always a bit more acceptable because it's human error. And so it makes that fallibility of tech also a little bit more, it rears its head, I guess. But what my point is that it also helps, at least me, think about whether or not, how many times we sort of let technology fail before we say, okay, this is not the right use for this. So just a more open, maybe slightly controversial thing I'll say on it, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. And Natali, so just to get your sense of, in response to this, around questions of accountability, responsibility, and tying in with the other question that was posed around self-regulation, sometimes kind of being seen as a kind of shield to protect trust and credibility. But we also know that regulation and technology are completely different animals when it comes to the pacing and development of these. How do we build these frameworks that can be effective, that can be implemented internally, whilst also recognizing that at this stage we probably can't regulate for all the potential uses and risks of AI in newsrooms?
Yeah, thank you. And actually, that who is responsible is also a question that we asked our panel in the AP survey. And interestingly enough, most participants agreed it's the editors that have some responsibility here, even more than the legal department, which I found interesting. What I take from this is that we increasingly recognize that editorial responsibility is not only about the content we publish, but also the way we use technology in creating and distributing content. And I think that is something important to realize. So that this notion of editorial responsibility is maybe extending also to the kind of technologies we use, and also involves a process of orchestrating all these different parties in a newsroom that together make sure that the use of this technology is responsible. So maybe we really need to rethink a bit the role of editors here, which is of course also central in self-regulation. Self-regulation is super important. it's only going so far, and any self-regulation is as good as it's being enforced. But I also would like to draw attention to, and Scott and also Ava already mentioned regulation, that I think the real regulation of generative AI at the moment is taking place in secondary levels of regulation. So think of technical standardization, which will have a huge impact on the kind of technologies and the way technologies are built. But also think about this whole risk management approach, because as you already said, it's really difficult to foresee how some of these technologies develop. And that's why we see that legal frameworks around the world, in Europe, but also in Brazil, being discussed in China, in the US, work more and more on this risk-based approach. And that essentially means that it's technology companies that will have an important task to identify these risks. And then regulators will develop standards on how to do this. And then if you read, for example, the system card of OpenAI, where they describe their risk assessment framework, media is not mentioned one single time. And I think this is again something to think of. So we have this standardization, the risk assessment processes, but also things like the European Code of Conduct for Gen AI providers. There will the real rules for responsible development of these technologies are made. And media are not very active in these areas. And I think here are real opportunities to help identify what are the risks that we should tackle in the media sector, because they're not always on the top of the mind of AI companies or regulators.
Yeah, I think it's a critical point around the role or that interplay between the media and the large platforms and the intermediaries. Scott, maybe you can weigh in here around sort of what kind of role can the media play? What kind of leverage points can the media use in engaging with the accountability levels of the large tech platforms in terms of how that affects the news media?
I mean, that's a very big question, because it's a two-way street in many ways. It's not an equal street, but it is a bit of a two-way street, because there are a number of these big tech platforms that are looking for archives, that are looking for training data. And so that does give some negotiating power to newsrooms themselves. At the same time, newsrooms have been identified as a buyer of these types of technologies. So, there is this back and forth question around procurement, contracting, archival use, fair use, and all those types of matters that may in fact be, that should not be, but will probably be determined by individual newsrooms, which gets back to questions around self-regulation, collective accountability. One of the things to say about self-regulation and collective accountability is if you're taking a very sort of statecraft-centric view of this type of regulatory action, and it's certainly not the only way to regulate AI and the like, but one of this is to try to reduce the costs of the state on regulations by giving the sector a social license. But that social license is always contingent. And so if companies themselves aren't fulfilling the best of what we expect out of the self-regulatory paradigm, then that social license can be revoked. So there is certainly a role for the state to be very active and interventionist over here. Again, it also depends on which kind of state and which kind of government and things like that. The other thing that I would say, and this is drifting a little bit from your question, so forgive me, is that the way that we think a little bit about ethics in the sector, I find a little bit too narrow. Like, I sometimes think we're thinking more, and there's certainly good reason to, but more from a professional ethics as opposed to the ethics of the moral philosopher. And, like, people don't really like to listen to the moral philosopher lecture. But it's very interesting to me that when we are talking about ethics, questions around exploitation, alienation are very far from the agenda. Those things seem to be very much bracketed out. And I think matters like that are very important when we think about, there's this desire to have agentic AI complement, but we also know that many commercial presses want to control their costs. So to what extent is AI going to be involved in further gigifying journalistic work and news production? Obviously, the top tier newsrooms will always have funding. There will be a billionaire class that supports vanity presses, whether it be, the Washington Post is a very good example of this. But what happens then to lower resourced presses as these technologies cascade down? So I also think that when it comes to regulation, we shouldn't necessarily be looking at the responsible AI paradigm. That's good, but it's insufficient. We need to think beyond responsible AI to really put questions around alienation, exploitation, stratification on the agenda. These much more the political economy of ethical conduct that's not just simply based upon vocational pressures that people are facing in their day-to-day lives. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So just a reminder to everyone, please keep posting your questions in the chat, in the Q&A section in particular, and we will try and answer as many of these as we can. Just to kind of put us in the picture again from these discussions, at the moment, we're looking at these different forms of regulation, from whether that is self-regulatory model, guidelines, state level, and the pros and cons, challenges in each. I think we can probably say that there's no silver bullet, but there are, I think, evolving practices, good practices, recommended practices that we are seeing emerging through different efforts and initiatives. And Ava, I want to come back to you about a point that you raised specifically. I think it's such an important point that you raised around, yes, AI is kind of the new hot topic, but we should also, we should approach it with caution. It's not a given that newsrooms are or must be using it. But where newsrooms are using it, and there are so many potential advantages that newsrooms can benefit from it. Can you give us a bit more content at a practical level around, from an ethical perspective, what are the elements of transparency? What are the practical steps? I mean, there's a question in the chat around, should we state the usage of AI in our articles and news? What would your recommended practices be?
No, so I mean, I think that just a little bit more explanation on that, right? I think that when we say that it's a human-led industry, for instance, and that's what a lot of people have been saying as well, is that there has to be intervention, oversight, et cetera, from human beings. I think that actually sorely is needed even without AI, because the media is a space that frankly already suffers from biases, ethical constraints, and availability of authentic information, right? So I think that we have to be able to take those decisions that serve us and not decisions that serve technology. So in my mind, what we think about as a human-centric approach or a user-centric approach is not to always say that, okay, so here's the way in which AI is being used, here's the ethical constraint, or here's where we might be walking into morally murky territory. The approach is generally to sharpen or make the AI or the technology better in order to make sure that it is therefore able to regulate its own bias or regulate its own sort of problems, right? But I think that the approach rarely kind of does the flip, which is that, is this a decision that serves technology, or is this the decision that serves human beings? Because I think that making something sharper or better or less prone to the risks that it itself brings into the picture don't always sort of allow human beings to feel like they specifically address their issues. So I mean, I think just as a general approach, I think that is prevalent, right? I think that the idea is that when tech is imagined as the space for intervention, innovation, problem solving, design, et cetera, it is that conduit. It is the space where you have to make those decisions. But I think that we need to think about transparency as an allyship tool, right? Which is to say that there has been allyship between the audience and the news. And to be able to embed, I think, a bit of a trustworthiness approach in journalism is not new, but the pressures of being authentic and transparent are greater than ever. And I think really radical but good journalism will not be scared of that pressure. So sorry, I see Natali with her hand up. I didn't know if she wanted to come in there.
Yeah, please, Natali, jump in.
Yeah, how interactive do you want this? No, I totally agree on the import. You said two things, Eva. On the one hand, informing the audience, and on the need of transparency. I agree on both. What I'm always surprised is how little we ask actually the audience what kind of information they need to be informed well. And I mean, lawyers are really good also in that, in stipulating some transparency obligations, and never ask if users really find them useful. So I think we need much more work also in involving users also from different cultures and continents in trying to understand what are their real information needs in order to identify authenticity.
And go ahead.
I just wanted to add one last point, right? And I think this comes back to, again, the threat of AI and what is it that we have to think about at that ethical level is that we are and we have been for a while walking into a bit of that unconscious dependency, and where we make the tech better so that it makes our life simpler. And so we then become more and more vulnerable to its failures and its biases, right? Because we then tie our fate so deeply and so intimately, right? So then the last point I'd just make on ethics is that it's important to keep challenging the cognitive barrier and not think of it as cognitive load that we're exchanging with AI or exchanging with technology. And we have to make sure that always that we have more cognitive territory than AI in any function that it might preserve or perform. But that was the last point.
Thanks. And I think you've raised such important points, that also tie to, what the broader discussion with Scott and Natali, that this is a tool, but it's a tool that exists within a long-standing kind of media ecosystem that has been using AI in many ways for many, many years, before ChatGPT and generative AI became the hot topics. Natali, just kind of posing this to you, I mean, what is your sense between, are we looking at developing new ethical standards around generative AI, or is it more about applying the existing established ethical journalistic standards to a new tool? Or is it somewhere between the two?
I think it's both and one more. So to one extent, these technologies do not develop and are implemented in a law or regulation-free space. There are already existing standards. Sometimes these traditional guidelines need to be adjusted to reflect the realities of a new technology. Think of issues around transparency, being transparent about your sources or the way you use Gen AI. Both are about transparency, but very different kinds of transparency, and the value of transparency gets a really different role here. And I think some of the issues are really new, and like for example, the whole thing of what kind of data should you be allowed or reasonably train these systems on, and what kind of, I mean, we really see a rearrangement of relationships here. I think something also that is really new that we have to think about more is we will see a steep increase in synthetic content. So, what kind of ethical issues are around using synthetic content, synthetic news anchors? These are some of the new issues that we really have to think about. Not only how to, responsibly mimic real people, but also how to deal with a world where in a near future, probably the largest part of content is synthetic. And that creates new issues.
So we've got about a minute left, and I wish we had more time to discuss all of these issues. Just before I say thank you to the panelists and to all of you, just to note that we have shared, the team has shared a number of resources that will be put into the chat. Please engage with them and keep engaging with, feel free to reach out on any of these issues. Working backwards from where we started, Scott, in 30 seconds or less, I mean, what is your kind of takeaway piece of advice to newsrooms and other stakeholders grappling with what to do with AI and regulating it in newsrooms? So?
Well, if you're asking me to end, I'm definitely not going to do the doom and gloom. There's certainly space for negotiations. Newsrooms shouldn't think of themselves that they're going to be overwhelmed by a wave. They do have bargaining power, they do have leverage, and they do have audiences, which are very important that they need to build, maintain, leverage. And these things are very valuable to help secure their freedom of expression. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm definitely not looking for doom and gloom. Ava, what's kind of your parting message? For now, at least.
No, I think just coming back to some of what I said in the beginning, right? Regulation is not just the work of regulators. Media and news production is not just the work of journalists. And consumption and risk and failure isn't something just that the user will combat. And so we have to, I think about the way in which we unite not against AI, but unite to make AI bent to collective wills and not specifically address its own issues in siloed ways against who that AI is for. But that's basically all I'll say.
Brilliant. And Natalie?
I think we really need to understand responsible use of Gen AI as a process with many different actors, many different stakeholders, many different information asymmetries and moving targets. So it's not a one time off checklist. Now we are responsible. It's really a process for which we need to create room, agency, and feedback loops.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I think, regulation is only one part of it. It becomes the enforcement, the training, the kind of iterative process of it. And I think there's lots of really useful resources out there for organizations to refer to. I want to say a big thank you again to the panelists for this very important and informative discussion, and a big thank you again to the team for making it possible for us to be here and to join you for this.